morning, good afternoon, or good night, depending on where you are located. Um, Here at the AWA Plus D, I'm Luciana Varcuj. I'm the advocacy chair for this year, 2019-2020. I'm very happy to introduce to you, to everybody, Open Mic 2 about gender and urban space in times of COVID. The right to the city literature has not fully acknowledged that cities and how they are designed are not gender neutral. Research shows that a large number of women use public transit more often and make more trips on foot than men, splitting their time between work and family commitments, such as taking care of children and elderly parents. In contrast to that, the location of bus stops, how well lit streets are, and the fear of physical or sexual violence in public spaces and when using public transportation can greatly affect women and girls' movement, and as a result, they cannot fully benefit from opportunities offered by cities. The COVID-19 pandemic added a new layer to the situation, a tremendous growth of demand for public space. Can we look at this as an opportunity to rethink gender equality in cities? Open Mic 2 invites Giulia, Maci, and Leslie Kern to discuss their work in the field, highlighting that the participation of female voices during the city planning process is an urgent matter. Giulia Maci is an urban specialist in gender-sensitive city development, youth engagement, and community-based action planning with work experience in more than 20 countries across Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America. She leads the Cities for Women Global Program at Cities Alliance, UNOPS in Brussels. Leslie Kern, Associate Professor of Geography and Environment and Director of Women and Gender Studies at Mount Allison University, author of Sex and Revitalize the City, Gender Condominium Development, and the Urban Citizenship and Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World. We are very excited to have both of you. We're gonna set up more of a conversation. So Leslie's gonna start the conversation introducing her, talking a little bit about her work. Same thing with Giulia. And yeah, so I think the idea is this panel to be more of a conversation, then we can start with some questions triggered by this beginning, and then we can open to the audience for if they have any questions as well. And yeah, we are very excited to have you both here. And I'm sorry if any extra noise is happening. I'm gonna make sure that I'm on mute. And I was also gonna ask everybody, if you're not speaking, make sure that you are on mute. We are recording on speakers mode. So just the person who's speaking is gonna be recorded. So I hope that everybody is okay with that. But if you wanna ask a question, then when we open to the audience, just be aware if you don't want to be recorded, keep your camera off. And yes, let's start this conversation. So Giulia and Leslie, welcome.
Hi, Luciana. Thank you. Hello to everyone.
Hi, welcome everyone.
So Leslie, yeah, the stage is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, and to everyone who's turning up on a Saturday to listen to us speak. And please feel free to put questions in the chat, and I think Luciana and others will keep track of them, and we'll try to come back to them. So as Luciana mentioned, I'm an urban geography professor and gender studies scholar, and I recently published a book called Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World. It's available from Verso in the US and UK if anyone is looking for it there. And in this book, I'm trying to sort of communicate some ideas from feminist geography and urban geography with a wider audience of people than I would normally reach in my kind of academic everyday life. And some of the ideas that I was trying to communicate in the book are around the ways in which our cities, any of our human-made built environments, but focusing on cities and thinking about how they are not just these stages or neutral containers where social relations play out. They the built environment is also kind of an active participant in shaping social relations, shaping our economy, shaping our families and our interpersonal relationships, shaping our care work, shaping our safety and our livelihoods in many ways. So even though we don't look at the buildings and think that they have like a consciousness and that they're consciously deciding to either, uphold patriarchy or white supremacy or class inequality, but at the same time, those buildings are streets, cities, neighborhoods, they reflect the values, ideals, and norms of the society who built them, and predominantly of those who are in power in the society that built them. And quite a literal way, we know that in most places, the professions of planning and architecture and urban design are still quite male-dominated fields. They're very white-dominated fields, so there tends to be a kind of lack of diversity there. So one of the kind of messages that I hope that people, especially in the kind of planning, design, and architecture worlds, might take away from the book and from my work is to think about the ways in which city life is actually very messy, it's very embodied, it's very complicated, and sometimes it's quite irrational. So planning and architecture, I think, like to think of themselves as very rational, objective professions where they're, planning for highest and best use and making the most efficient use of space and all of these kinds of values and principles, yet at the same time, the way that people use the city is not necessarily in line with those values. And particularly when we think about designing for a diverse range of users, including women, but also other marginalized groups and different groups in the city, our experiences of moving through those spaces and using those spaces is often quite different than what the people who designed them intended or thought. And partly this is, again, due to a kind of lack of diversity in the profession for thinking through how spaces are going to be used. But also it's kind of a result of that, thinking about people moving through the city. Well, I'm moving from home to work, blah, 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 linear journey, without thinking like, who needs to stop and pump breast milk on the way, right? Like that is probably not something that is at the forefront of your average transportation planner, right? But what if it was, or what if these were part of a list of considerations that people were thinking about? And I imagine that when you hear that, you might think, well, why would we be designing just for this minority of people? Well, I want to question that a little bit and say that, first of all, when you design for a more marginalized group, you are not excluding the quote unquote majority. The majority will be fine. The people who have always moved through the city with relative ease will be fine. Designing ramps, for example, does not stop the movement of people who are able-bodied. So the majority will be fine, but I also want to question what the reality behind majority is. So we know, for example, that actually quite a large proportion of the population has a disability of some sort, and sometimes we don't see it or we don't know it, and that number is growing, especially as we have an aging population. So the elderly are not a minority, really, in many ways and in many places. Most adults will have children at some point in their lives, or perhaps be caregivers for children. So designing for families and parents is not designing for a minority. And of course, we all have certain basic needs. We all need to use the bathroom. We all need to sit down sometimes. We all need shade and water and rest. And thinking about those things is not a kind of special needs category for people in the city. That should be a human needs category. So one of the other points of the book is to think about some of the unspoken assumptions that maybe still rest behind a lot of planning and design decisions. And, I want to encourage people to sort of excavate those. And certainly the pandemic has been really useful for perhaps revealing some of the assumptions that have continued to linger. So one of the ones that I have thought a lot about is the idea of home as a safe space. The idea, first of all, that everybody has a home, which is, of course, not true in most places. And the idea that home is a safe space, that if we retreat to our homes, then that is a space of safety. But for many people, especially women and children, home has never been the safest space, even though we've been programmed to believe it will be. And we know that under the pandemic, most of the reports that we've seen about domestic violence has been that there seems to have been an increase in domestic violence during the time of lockdown. So we have to question this idea about, what is home to many people. We also know that there has been a lot of assumptions about care work. And one of the most obvious ones in the time of the pandemic has been that somebody will be available at home to look after children, right? That when you are, when schools close, when daycares close, that there's just somebody at home, right? Which of course ignores the reality that most families these days, there is not a full-time stay-at-home parent. And yet I think that for a lot of people who make these decisions, they just didn't really consider how that was going to play out. And of course, we know that a lot of the very feminized and therefore undervalued paid care and service work has been paid so poorly. Those workers have been treated so poorly that they have either had to make sort of an impossible choice between continuing their essential work and caring for their families, or they've had to put themselves at risk, their families at risk, and their clients and other people at risk by going to work under these conditions. There's also a lot of assumptions about mobility. So I was just reading an article today about my hometown, Toronto, very big city. Like many cities over the past few decades, the central city has kind of gentrified. It's quite white and wealthy, but the inner suburbs surrounding that are very racialized, a lot of recent immigrant families, much poorer. And those areas are the areas where people take buses to get places. Those are the areas where the people who are the essential workers in service industries, food, transportation, healthcare, and so on, that's where they live, not in the shiny condo towers of downtown. So the article I was reading today was about how the bus routes in those areas are super crowded, and especially as the weather is getting colder, people are being pushed and pushed onto these buses, and there's no way to physically distance in those places. So the assumption that people can make safe, healthy choices about mobility is also one that I think has underpinned some things, and we're seeing that exposed. And we've even seen a lot of like COVID testing centers are drive-in centers. You drive into the tent to get your COVID test, but not everybody has a car. And many of these centers are also they're not easily accessible by public transit or by walking. So these are just some of the assumptions that I think have been long underlying a lot of urban planning and thinking about cities, but the pandemic has kind of expose some of them, and I would note that the pandemic has made some of these issues much worse, so those mobility issues and so on. So just to close my remarks, a couple of things that if you are in sort of a planning or design profession, what role can you play here? And so I would challenge people to say, well, do you think about the work of caring for others, of caring for other human beings when you're designing or building spaces? Is that part of your equation? Whether that's how will someone change a diaper? How will somebody take care of an elderly person, a disabled person in their community? How will they take care of their own physical needs? When you think about how spaces are connected through mobility and transportation networks, are you thinking just about moving from home to work or home to shopping? Or are you also thinking about trips to school, daycare, the doctor, the playground, the grocery store, and so on? Do you consider something like domestic violence to be a planning or a space issue? And if not, why not? And I don't mean that as a personal challenge to anybody. I think that that has not been part of thinking around design and planning. So, how do our current housing designs and developments and zoning practices in cities potentially make domestic violence worse or limit the ways in which we could think of solutions, alternative housing forms, a better shelter system, and so on? And the last thing I'll say is this question of who do you consult? And I think Giulia is going to talk about consultation and participation, but this question of who do you consult right from the beginning as part of your projects? Whose voices are there? Whose are missing? Who is in the room? Who's not in the room? And if they're not in the room, how are you going to find them? How are you going to hear from them before your project is built and you go, oh wait, this is actually not a user-friendly space, or this is a space that makes some people feel unsafe when it's almost too late to do anything about it. So starting from the ground up with that sort of diversity of participation is, I think, one route, one place that planners and designers can start to be more active. So those are my remarks. I'll turn it over to Giulia, I guess, to carry on. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. These are great remarks and I think great provocations for our field as designers, right? Definitely looking to a more multidisciplinary approach when designing and searching for that from the very beginning of when we are creating projects, right? From the very, very beginning. We're gonna talk more about that. Giulia, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm trying. Okay. Yes, thank you. I think I will continue a bit what Leslie was saying. I, by the way, read the book, the last book, and I loved it, so I was recommended. Let me share the presentation, prepare the short presentation just to tell a bit about also my work. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see it?
Yes, yes, we can see.
Yes, so I come from an architecture background. Then I focus on planning and urban planning, but I really believe that the spatial dimension and space can somehow help us to visualize and touch inequalities. So what Leslie said at the beginning, through the spatial lens, we can see it. And I really believe that now it's this webinar is called in times of COVID, but also before, I think as people working like urban professionals, so people working with the built environment, we have almost, I think, an imperative to use planning, design, as tools to address inequalities, gender inequalities, social inequalities, economic inequalities, and try to connect with other disciplines, with other know-how, try to understand these inequalities. This is also what I found, I read recently this sentence by Lina Bobardi that probably Luciana you know, so was an architect from Italy and Brazil. And I really believe so, that architecture and urban design is above all a social issue. And I think it's important to work in a multidisciplinary team and in a multidisciplinary way because, for instance, when we talk about gender inequalities has multiple dimensions in a city. And it's very important to recognize these different dimensions. I think Leslie touched upon certain topics. I would like to go through very quickly some data about also the global south. So for instance, when we talk about economy in cities, women are still excluded. For instance, land ownership. There are countries where women cannot, by law, own land. They cannot have the property, and in some countries, even if by law they can, in reality, in practice, they can't. And this means they don't own the means of production for agriculture, for housing, and so on. Also, in terms of informal economy, by now we know that the majority of our economy in cities globally is informal, and we cannot just formalize the informal, but we need to understand what informality is and understand the nuance of this informality. Well, the majority of informal workers, the vast majority is made by women. So for instance, in India, we're talking about 86% of informal workers. And I can see recently, during the COVID time, also now, women in India, they left the cities. So women that were working as domestic helpers or women that were working in the construction sector, they didn't have protection, they didn't have childcare. So they had to leave and go back to their rural town. And we don't even know if they will be able to go back to their cities sometime soon. So this is another aspect, Then safety. Yes, domestic safety is one big issue. With the COVID, we saw that domestic violence is increasing, as Leslie said, but also safety in public space. While men feel most of the time safe in public space, women don't. For instance, in Cairo, 83% of Egyptian women have been sexually harassed. So they are exposed to violence and to harassment. So if women don't feel safe in public space, this means that public space and urban space is not for everyone and is not a place for them. So they are excluded. Also in terms of infrastructure and basic service, also there we can see gender inequality. For example, we know that the majority of the world urban population don't have access to toilet, only 27%. And again, women are the ones that consist the majority of this number. So not having access to public toilets seems a kind of trivial thing, but in reality is one of the main issues in terms of gender equality in cities, because this means that women need to find space outside, isolated, and this also is related to more violence and more harassment. So toilets are not even designed, no, even in big cities in Europe, for women, for menstrual need, for childcare need. So it's one of the big topics. And then also collecting water, access to water. Still, women need to do like multiple trips a day to collect water. And this, of course, means time consumption and less time for education and for profession, for training. And this also results in the fact that only, among the people that cannot read, 2/3 are women. So when we see about like this kind of inequalities, I'm also asking myself why we're not doing anything. And this is also related to another aspect, which is the political level representation. Women are not there, are not represented in a decision-making position, also at the city level. No? This is a picture of the General Assembly of Asian Mayors Forum, and only 12% of mayors worldwide are women. So as you can see, no, what I said at the beginning, gender inequality in cities is a kind of multiple dimension, and we need to connect somehow and to understand how to address these issues almost at the same time. And I think, you know, what Leslie said, I think when we talk about a feminist city, it's, to me, you know, is a city with more inclusive public space, with the basic services for everyone, with participatory tools that allow for decision making, are more walkable cities, are cities with better public transport. So at the end, are cities that are better for everyone. And I still believe that also cities are also the place for freedom, and where citizenship and equality are also redefined. These are some of the places where women took the street, they protest, they were at the forefront also of different type of protest. They were in public space again, using, of course, technology, which is another big topic when we talk about gender equality. So they are there, they are active, no, in reclaiming their rights. And this is, for instance, the blue bra graffiti in Cairo during the revolution became the kind of symbol of the Egyptian revolution. It was a woman, a girl that was arrested, and she wore a blue bra. So to me, it's a kind of an image of freedom, an image of community connection, of change, you know? And at the same time, also women, we can see it in many cities, they are also most of the time community leaders. So they are really drivers for development. And I think we have to also to stop considering women a kind of vulnerable groups that we need to protect. They are normally excluded from decision making, but we need to recognize also their value, no, as the drivers of change, as contributors in community development. And also during the COVID crisis in many cities, we were doing some kind of emergency work and distribution of relief and community funds. and we always used or collaborate with the women's group, because they were the ones that knew the community needs, and where also people in need were in the city. So they knew also informal areas much better than others. So in general, I really believe, and this is what I'm also trying to do in my work, that we need to rethink urban governance process and trying to adopt new forms of engagement that can really understand better. So having also type of questions and data to understand and to also to include the needs, expectation, also capacity of women. And right now I'm working, even if in this challenging situation, like online and so on, in different cities. And I've developed this kind of a framework that really try to engage women from the design, from the assessment phase, to understand what are the needs in that specific place, and then design with them, or having them in any case at the center of the design and co-creation process, towards piloting, construction, and then also evaluation. I would like to go through this process. I think would be interesting also for the discussion. I would like also to have feedback, because it's something that we are also kind of testing somehow in different cities. Normally, when we do urban planning, we don't have, for example, sex disaggregated data. Normally, we say that there were women in the room in that participatory workshop, but we really don't, I think, consult and engage women. No? So we have to find different ways to do so. So we connect this. I will focus on the assessment. So what we are trying to do in different cities, we're trying to combine quantitative data through survey, online survey in different languages, through WhatsApp since the lockdown. We are trying different things. Also with radio shows in Africa to get also feedback from people that don't have internet, and then workshops as well to try to collect also qualitative and perception of women in their about their cities and about how they feel, and the level of engagement and participation of women in that specific cities. So we are trying to ask, basically, to evaluate the level of engagement from critical 1 to full. And this is just also to have a kind of quantitative measurement of this type of perception. And we are looking, as I said, at participation and engagement at different levels. So what we call precondition, so which is safety, tolerance, trust, land right, but then also political, institutional participation, human and social capital, education, and economic. And then for each this sphere, we identify for each sub-indicators question. That is what we ask women in that cities to respond. So for instance, for entrepreneurship and employment policy, we ask, how do you assess the policy in your cities, and kind of guidance and kind of some indicators. For instance, in this case, are there any childcare places, where how many, the cost, ease of access. And women can respond also in a kind of participatory way in workshops. And in the end, we formulate a sort of city profile for women engagement, where we combine different data coming from, as I said, from different sources, and we can identify immediately which policy area needs some work and needs some attention and some support. And this type of information then feed into the plans and the work that we are doing, the projects. At the moment, I'm working in different places, so quite very different. And we are working in different projects using this type of methodology as well to engage, no? And we are reusing also during the project and at the end also to evaluate how the project is going. So for instance, in Banjul, in Gambia, which is a city which is quite interesting because for the first time they have a woman as a mayor, so she's very strong on gender equality. We are doing the Greater Plan for 2040, and we are engaging women in the process to identify the plan. And we will conclude the plan, I think, next year, early next year. In Monrovia, in Liberia, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, they went through Ebola. Then they had civil war for 14 years, and then now the COVID. But they are extremely really a resilient community. We are building water kiosks in informal settlements with women. So we are giving women's group the possibility to manage and to maintain the water kiosk, which is quite different from the usual. So normally, women collect water, but men manage the water kiosk. And in Liberia, also in Monrovia, during the COVID, now the situation is getting better. We also work a lot on advocacy, identifying also messages, putting these messages in markets, through radio, also connecting the gender dimension, no? So trying to understand, so for instance, giving also a number for domestic violence, or supporting also women that work as for example informal vendors, no? That they cannot stop working because they depend on the daily income. For instance, in Uganda, this is a market, it's called Nakawa Market. It's an informal market, and we are now building, we're starting to build toilets, again with women. Here, really the majority of the vendors are women, and food is basically food vendors. And during the lockdown, they couldn't go back to their home by law, so they had to stay in the market, sleeping here. And so there was an increase also of violence here. So we are also intervening in kind of reorganizing the places to allow a bit of social distance. So this is the case of Kampala. We are also working in other two informal communities. This is an app, so talking about public space, this is an app that we supported, it's called Safety Pin, and has been tested mostly in India, but also now in different cities. And it's basically to collect data on safety of public space, so women directly evaluate a specific place. So in terms of also data, this is extremely helpful, no? for planners to intervene in public space. And this is what we are doing in Tunis. It's called Femme Medina. So Tunis, as you know, so the Medina is quite unique in terms of public space. It's more kind of linear, no? Public space, the souk, and then the cafes that are mostly used by men, and then the markets. And so we are working here with women as well in designing public space. So there is a question of heritage, and there is a question of redesign public space, responding to specific women's needs. In Tunisia, we're also working in supporting women that have been elected. Tunisia is kind of unique country in this sense because there is a law, that recent law, 2017, that basically says that 50% of every political list need to be made by women. And this, of course, resulted in almost 40% of women elected at council level. But they are elected, but they don't have capacity, they don't have also experience. So we are working with women on gender mainstreaming, gender budgeting, local public policies, quite political and it's quite difficult. And this is a former project that I'm not involved in. It was in India, and it was mobile crash, so the creation of crash, of childcare, following construction worker, exactly. So they normally move around, and this system was following them and supporting them. So this is more or less some projects, and kind of I'm trying to connect this kind of intervention with an overall assessment and the participation process that goes really from the beginning to the end. Let's see, I think sometimes it's challenging, but I think there is really, I can see a will and of women to participate in the city development. And somehow I think is also the fact that we are talking about concrete things, space, makes also, in a way, the participation easier somehow, no? Because women really can say what they need and how they can, how they want to see also their city, their public space, and so on. So, thank you. This was my contribution.
Thank you, Giulia. That was great. Yeah, I have. Well, we can definitely start our conversation, and it's interesting, right? Because I think Giulia's presentation definitely, and I think we talked a little bit about that, right? Makes us understand that we live in a bubble, right? I think that some of the situations that we deal with when it starts to open up with such a global umbrella, right? And we see so many opportunities and things happening right now. And then when we go back, okay, what is our daily lives and how we are working, the things that we are working with, right? It is kind of a bubble, right? And I wonder, how can we learn from what, Giulia, what you've been experiencing working in those countries, right? Which I think it has a different level of issue, not denying the issues that also the US might be going through, or Europe, but I think we definitely can look at the global South as a different level of opportunities and ways that people are looking for changing things, right? And I think also having the experience of working a little bit in Africa, that the fact that even here in Brazil, the fact that people know that they might not have a lot of government support, they have to do it yourself, right? So I think there is a lot of a community level of engagement that I wonder how that plays a different role from the global South versus what's happening, right, in a more North Hemisphere situation. So I kind of wonder, how do you see also from your background working in Europe, right? How do you see, and having your education from that, how do you see, and I think, again, right, I was very curious about your work too, how can we create more opportunities of other areas learning from what's happening from your experience, right? Even the way that you phrase this framework, and how exactly we learn from that, and can we transfer to other parts of the world, right? And I think that will be one of the things that I was wondering of us to approach in this conversation. I think also Leslie, both you and Leslie mentioned about the trivial things, right? Be the toilets that is necessary, or the trips that should be including breastfeeding, and plus a lack of representation in the decision making. And again, I want to pose the provocation that the lack of representation is also happening in design field, right? And policy making. So, and in the design field, I also urge my woman friends to look at those things, right? I don't think that is just a situation that when we are designing, I do think that it's not just man versus woman looking at issues. I think we all should be looking at things, and I see that certain things are not considering even when I'm designing a group with female designers, right? So I think the question is like, how can we change that, right? How can we learn, I think one thing from the global South, how can we, looking at things, and I don't want to sound the hopelessness here, but how can we, if there are certain things that we have to change, so much things that comes from the base of the foundation of how those things are being structured right now, right? How do you see a potential of change?
Well, I think, yeah, I worked also in Europe, and I studied in Italy and in the Netherlands. And I honestly believe that is also related to education. Personally, to me, it's absurd that a country like Italy, where we have young people living in the country, we have an aging population, we have new population coming from Africa, we have a city center that are basically becoming touristic place, attraction, there is peripheral areas that are completely cut off. I mean, all this topic, and then in the architecture school we are talking about how to design a family house in the countryside, or how to design a museum, and I think so. And then of course there is the world as well, no? So cities that are exploding, demographics like basic services, and cities that need architects and needs like not architects, but in any case people that have this kind of spatial dimension, that they connect things in space. And to me, the education has a big role, because we need to pose these questions to our students, at least at university. They should be able to explore this kind of question, even if at the end they will be the architects that just do the innovation. I mean, it's a noble, great work, but like the innovation of the house. But at least to be exposed to these questions, because these are contemporary questions, these are political questions, but like moral questions as well. So yeah, I would say that education and it's key. And I don't know why university, at least in I think in Europe, are still so behind, no? So maybe Leslie, that she's coming from university, can also comment.
Thanks. Well, I definitely come at these topics much less from like a practitioner point of view, because my training is not in planning or design. My training is actually, in feminist theory. So I'm coming at the city from that point of view. But yeah, I mean, I wanted to, Luciana was sort of saying, what's the potential for change and so on. And one of the things that Giulia was mentioning, like the mobile creche, for example, or the example of the water kiosks that are not just like made accessible to women, but are being managed by women. And that really like struck me, because I think part of one piece that maybe is often missing is like, even when we're consulting, are we going that step further and thinking like, who is going to essentially have like ownership? And I don't necessarily mean like monetary ownership, but sort of everyday control over these resources and spaces. And it seems so simple to say, well, yeah, women should manage the water kiosk. That would give them a sense of, both like responsibility and accountability to it, and greater accessibility and maybe greater safety amongst other women. It seems so simple, and yet I think it's something that we probably almost never consider, especially in a North American context where, our sort of sense of ownership is always very strongly delineated. But it also reminds me of, thinking just historically about movements like even the movement against domestic violence. The first shelters were just networks of women's homes, right? That people would say, we know someone who needs a safe space, and you call the phone network, and it's, you get somebody to a safe house. And eventually those became actual centers that we call shelters today. But it started from that grassroots. And we still see a lot of like, even though now, governments fund the shelters and so on, but we still see a lot of like very local women's control of those spaces that has kind of held off a lot of like government kind of intrusion in terms of their own way of thinking about how those spaces should be run. So I think that's just a crucial piece of the picture, is that question of who gets to be in charge, right? Who gets to have some say over those spaces that we design, even like in terms of their long-term use. So that was just something that I picked up on that I thought was like, even I hadn't really been thinking about that, but it's a really great piece of the puzzle.
Definitely. Let me take a look at the chat. And also, I think part of what I wonder, right? I think from Giulia's, I think we also had a conversation in terms of how, right, how you're implementing your agents as an agent, right? Who you work for is implementing things in different countries in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. And I think one thing that came up also was the fact that it also relates to local governments, right? And now I think Giulia mentioned how there's a change of government that happened in Brazil, and I think we see what's happening in the US. So vote, everybody out there, vote. I think voting is definitely right. One thing that is in our hands to potential change things. But it's interesting also to see how that change end up not allowing an agents like yours, right, Giulia, to fully have access to things that are happening and contact things, right? The sponsorship or ways of motivating those connections and those networks to happen within countries, it also depends on who, right, what are the politics behind. And I think from all the points that you both raised, right, education definitely, and who gets to be in charge, I think those are two key points of how we potentially promote change, right? And again, I think it also struck me about the idea of voting, right? Because if that kind of relationships also depend on politics, right? How exactly we can have leadership in those countries that allows those connections and that communication and the network to happen, right? Because if we are going to be learning from each other, somehow that information needs to be out there, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm really happy and excited by the fact that both of you accepted this invitation to share this conversation, right? And I think we're gonna be definitely posting this online so they can reach out to a larger people, because I think that's how can we learn about those things, like listening to experts, because I do consider you both experts, because we have to learn from each other, right? So I think those are, yeah, I think the leadership in terms of politics also become definitely an issue, right?
Yeah, I would like to just to touch upon 3 points. So I think what Leslie said about how we can do it differently. I think the data are also key. As I said, we don't have enough data. We don't have sex disaggregated data. So we have just data, for example, about one city, but not global data. We don't have quantitative. Sometimes we just qualitative. Or so for sure we need to have better data to show to show what is the situation. Then I think about the political representation. For example, the organization that I represent, we normally work long term in a country, so we don't go and just leave. No, we try to build political connection, and we try to stay in a country. We open up offices to do that with local people. And of course, and we try always to connect national policies. So we work on urban national policies, city level policy, and then community. So we are extremely well connected, for example, with all the informal workers, which is called, for example, Slum Dweller International, which is this huge organization of slum dwellers, trying to connect these three. No? So of course, when we have people like Bolsonaro coming in, and then it's very difficult to continue to be engaged in the country. So for sure, we can see that we are going a bit backward in terms of on one end. So there are the protests, there are grassroots movement, but then in terms of formal politics, I think we are going a bit backwards in terms of, for example, gender equality. So also in Europe right now, there is a conversation in France about how girls are going addressed at school. Because they attract, they kind of destabilize male professor, no? So it's incredible. 2020, there is this conversation. They have to dress up, they have to wear trousers, this kind of stuff. So that's definitely. I think there is also a question in the chat that I think is quite interesting.
Stephanie, do you wanna ask your question? Come on, Stephanie. Okay. So Stephanie, she's asking, in the US, public participation can result in those only most entitled are heard. How do you engage in public participation to make sure that those historically left out of the process are heard? And then you left a YouTube video, If a Woman Ran the World.
I don't, it's an important question. I think it's important the place where you do the participation process. You need to go, for example, if you work, like you have to work with informal community or the peripheral areas, so you have to be there, to go there, no? Somehow, and also to define a participatory process, so the moments that are the ones that are that can really attract people that, for example, they work the whole day, so you can have this moment maybe in the evening or during the weekend to allow this participation. And I think the key is also to make sure that when you ask people to participate, you are able to deliver a results. Because I think somehow I saw, and I also have been part of process, no? They were participatory, and at the end, we were not able to deliver anything. And then you create really a sense of frustration of people. People are, there is a distrust also in politics, in participatory process. They don't participate anymore because they don't believe. So I think it's very important to have a timeline in mind when you do participatory process. You know when, where, and you come up with the result. And then you can redefine and do differently afterwards. It's important to keep the trust of people. And we are always working with local community leaders and, as I said, even women leaders really to help us define this kind of process.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Giulia has much more on the ground experience with this than I do, but from my observation, I think often in North America, when there's going to be some kind of new development, a community hears about it because there's a notice placed on a construction post that says, you know, development proposal has been submitted for this address for a 40-story tower of residential units. There, small print, there will be a community meeting at this day. And people see that and they're like, well, fuck, this is done. Like, it's a done deal. People at that point, once the development notice goes up, you assume that either you are now fighting that development, which then just puts the public in this constant adversarial process with the city and planners and developers of having to like see something proposed and then argue against it. Or as Giulia says, like they give up, they don't trust, they don't think it doesn't matter if they show up to this community meeting. So yeah, the process has to be like, you have to be willing, I think, to be a lot slower about it, right? To be, if you are engaged in development or planning, to not propose something and see what the community says, but to go to the community first and like take that time. And it is much slower and it is messier and it's much more complicated to do it that way. So I know like people don't want it, they're under a lot of other pressure, but really those are the kinds of developments that then a community will feel some ownership over, will feel some accountability towards, will want to take care of and participate in and make better. But if you just plop something down, or if you just say, this is what we want to do, we dare you to fight us, like that's just kind of a nightmare situation. But that seems to be like much more normal in many cases. So yeah, that challenge. And then there's also the kind of like epistemic piece of it where it's like whose voices can actually be heard. You know, even if you do show up to the meeting, whose voices are really listened to, who are seen as knowing what they're talking about. And usually it's like, unless you look like the planners sitting at the front of the room, people don't assume that you have anything valuable to say, or that you are just always angry or always opposed to progress, this kind of narrative. So, you know, that question of like, who can we, you know, the can the subaltern speak, to go back to our old friend Spivak, right? Like who can be heard, right? And the question was never, can she speak, but like, can she be heard, right? And so that's a question I think that planners and city politicians can take on board too.
There is also, I think, in general, a use of this participatory washing style. No, we do a lot of participation, but the reality is fake. So it's just a consultation, and this is also an issue. No, so when I said, I think yes, it's true. No, it takes more time, but at the same time, you need, I think, to know your timeline, and you need to communicate to people. So when are the moment where we can see a result, so people also understand it's not just an open space where they can come and they really don't understand for what and when. I think both.
Totally. I see other questions popping up on the chat. Soana or Alejandra, do you guys should I read or you wanna speak up? Should I read the, okay. For the idea of engaging the stakeholders, specifically for the purpose of gender equality, Sona is mentioned, right? I found that sometimes I myself don't realize that the space was not designed for me because I do not know otherwise. For example, taking a sweater to work becomes a normal everyday practice. How do we go beyond the complex culturally embedded ideologies that prevent us from challenging the existing inequality in our surroundings and advocating for ourselves? Thanks, Sona.
That's a good question. Yeah, the point about, the temperature of most office buildings is set to a temperature that men find comfortable, but women don't. And, and that's men in suits, in like wool suits with multiple layers, the temperature they find comfortable, not, women in our sheer blouses and so on. So yeah, all of those things. And then you just think, oh, well, women are we're just cold all the time, like that it's not a structural problem. So part of it, I think, is, and this is what's been interesting, talking about my book and the people reading it and sort of saying, oh, I never thought about that, right? So partly it's just actually exposing how these decisions are made, where they come from, kind of denaturalizing it. So because you're right, it is so embedded that we don't tend to think of it as actually the result of layers and layers of decisions and so on that have shaped things in this way. So partly it's pointing it out. And I have found, people will say, oh yeah, now I like look at this space differently now that, I've read your book or I've heard somebody talk about this. And I think, so that's, it's not the end point, but that's at least the first step, is to recognize that and recognize that, yeah, you feeling cold in the office is not a you problem. It's not an individual problem. It's much wider. And you struggling to get your stroller onto the bus, that's not you, right? It's because the system wasn't designed to let you travel in that way. And then once you see it, you're like, then what to do about it is the next question, but which is the bigger question, and yeah, the one that requires a lot more work and time and effort.
Yeah, I just want to add that for sure, I think education, literature, and advocacy can expose, can show this new lens. And what I'm also trying now with this framework and also other methodology, for example, to map cities, public space with different indicators, engaging women to look at their cities, their everyday also itinerary map from a different point of view, so with different indicators, different questions. I think this is also kind of tools that I'm using, and sometimes, yes, women are saying, yeah, but I've never thought about that. I've never thought that it was a kind of gender implication in this. So yes, I think we can do it in practice, and then for advocacy, through research, and yeah, it's a collaborative effort.
Definitely. Stephanie added that sometimes it's one of my age that have with the control of the thermostat and it will still be cold. Sorry. All right, Alejandra, do you wanna add your comment?
Sure, I will. So my question is about how do we hold bad faith actors in power accountable for their actions? And I put the example of police brutality on there only because I don't feel like women are really represented in the police force, and that maybe this is what's causing those types of issues. But also, is it really just monetary? Like, is that how we can hold them accountable? Or how do we educate, police to be kinder and fairer and not just shoot people in the back sometimes? Yeah.
Well, already the question of safety, it's to me is questionable, no? Because it's been used also by, for example, cities saying that it's not safe just to control this place, to push away people, certain type of groups, and to control. This is also true with the COVID situation. So using the issue of safety just to control space, control people. And then I really think that when you have a strong community, I really believe that, strong community, well connected, you don't need the police. So we need to work much more on community building, on planning projects that include people, and then we will have less need of police. And then the police, yes, should be people that are educated, people with kind of psychological test. I don't know. This it's a bit out of my. I don't know. It's in Europe. We are also seeing these episodes of police brutality. Yeah, it's a kind of very complex issue, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with what Giulia says, that I think ultimately the goal is the end of the police, not better police or more women police or friendlier police, but essentially their end. And I think the question of accountability is so tricky, because the accountability systems that we have are like the criminal justice system, but that's what the police are part of. So it's inherently a contradiction that one half of the system should hold the other half of the system accountable for their actions. Like, and we see it over and over again with a general lack of accountability. And so I guess the thing that gives me hope is that all of the protests, like just physically being in the street, taking up space, fighting back, that is a kind of accountability, right? That is people saying, like, we don't, we're not going to take this anymore. We don't want this system. We don't believe your narratives about that we need you to protect us. Like, we don't buy that anymore, and we're going to push back against it. And, you know, even though, yes, I don't think we're immediately about to see a moment of fully abolishing or defunding the police, but the fact that we can have that conversation, or that conversation is like happening in like the New York Times or the Washington Post or on the BBC, you couldn't do that 5 years ago. Like, you could not legitimately have that conversation and force people in power to engage with that conversation. So the fact that we've come even that far, I think, is a step towards accountability. But yeah, I think it's a great question, Alejandra, and I wish, I wish that, because sometimes you feel like, you know, you can point out hypocrisy, you can point out all these things, and like, they don't care because they still have the power. But I'm pleased with, like, it heartens me to see the actual movements of people and the power of protest.
But I mean, I lived for years in Copenhagen, and there you don't see the police. So you don't see normally policemen in the street. And this is, I think Copenhagen is one of the safest cities in the world. So the connection between safety and the presence of police, it's almost the opposite, no? The more police you see, the more, the less safe a city is. So. So I agree. The end of police. It's the objective, I think.
Yeah, no, and then it opens that can of worms, right? Like when I'm thinking about Copenhagen, right? Probably there's less violence and less police because there is people might be able to access to things, right? And there is a question of access or less inequality.
It's a question of equality.
Totally.
They are not exposed to inequality, gender inequality, and economic inequality constantly. So this generates, I think, less, of course, conflict. So it's a society, I found it, with no conflict and very limited, very controlled conflict. So
Totally. I see one more question from Stephanie on the chat. Do you see your work as focused on incremental change or systematic change? Can you be doing both?
Well, I don't know. I think it's more incremental, I would say, incremental change. My feeling is that I'm not doing enough and I'm not doing what is needed. So I'm very critical about the work. I would like to have a more kind of systematic change. We really need to change the system at this point. I think it's quite obvious. Yeah. But
and I think partly, you know, we can only, in our day-to-day lives, we can only sort of control what we can control, right? There's only so many spheres of influence that we have, but I mean, my thinking about it is that, yes, like even on a day-to-day basis, what are like the little things that I'm doing to express sort of either my feminist politics or principles, or to create those kinds of spaces that I want to create. Maybe for me, that's like in my classroom on Zoom or whatever, but that's my space, that's my sphere. But at the same time, I'm always going to be arguing for and thinking about systematic change and participating where I can, whether those are in protest movements or the things that I say and write publicly. But at the same time, yeah, if we're so focused on, well, if I'm not overthrowing everything, that I'm not doing anything, then you really won't do anything, right? So you also have to, I think, be okay with sometimes the incremental things that you're doing, the difference that you make in people's lives, you know, close to you, or the organizations that you work with, while holding systemic change up there as the goal. But yeah, thank you for the clap, Sona.
But, you know, I don't want to sound a Pollyanna here, but I want to believe, right, a small change, big scale. So I think even the fact that you are here sharing your work, right, I think it's an educational process, right? So if more of us are aware, if a sense of awareness is triggered, right, and I think there is a knowledge that is shared, right? I'm a believer that somehow some level of change we might be promoting, right? Because if suddenly we are learning about those things and be conscious about those things, our work as designers can potentially change, right? Our next work can be opening our minds to more of those things to be implemented, right? And I also think in terms of educational field, right, schools, I think the discussions are out there. Definitely a lot of change that needs to be happening, right? A lot of politics that needs to change, policy making, who's making, right? Access, people being able to, minorities being able to access the school and the policy making field so that we can really shake the foundation of those issues. But I want to believe that even conversations like this can promote change. So I don't want to sound too, oh my God, right, eyes like bright right now, but we have to believe, because, and Giulia and Leslie, I appreciate you're saying, well, I might not be doing enough, but I think we have to believe that those small scale are promoting change and impacting, right, the level of impact that we can cause if you can put all those small scales together, something we are promoting, right? So I think it's about being conscious, learning and listening, right? And impact with how we do our work, live our lives. And I'm a believer that somehow we can, the small scale can also promote change.
But I think also the connection between different fields, so academia, political field practitioner, I think this is also key to find opportunity to come together, to share experience, and then to collaborate. It's not so obvious, but I think this is the way to go.
Agreed, agreed. Audrey, do you want to post your question?
Sure, I can read it. So recently I've been thinking about how in Ruth Bader Ginsburg's career, a major precedent for gender reform in the law actually happened because a man filed suit that a tax law was discriminatory against him. And that kind of opened a precedent for other change that, you know, discriminated against women. And it seems like it's so crucial to open the eyes of men to see and understand just how pervasive gender inequality is, and have them accept or see that feminism benefits them too, not just us. It's not just a fight for women. And so I wonder, in your work, have you seen examples where you know, successfully men got involved or fired up, and you know, what lessons we can learn from that?
Well, there's clearly not enough examples are jumping to my mind of these cases, but I mean, I will say that just on an anecdotal level from men who have, you know, shared with me that they read my book, like, you know, some of them have had those moments of being like, oh, I never noticed how somebody with a stroller is struggling to move around this space, or I never thought about bathroom access, or I never knew this need or that need. So that's, I think, encouraging. And, you know, I think there is more awareness amongst many men about trying to take up a little bit less space, both not just physically. I mean, I don't just mean the man spreaders on the subway, but I mean their space in a room, their space in a meeting, their power. And so more of an effort to say, okay, well, you know, I want to yield my space and time to this woman to speak on this issue, or this person of color to speak on this issue. So I think as more examples of that happen, more models of men seeing other men do that, because I think we know, like, if men were going to just listen to women about feminism, like, it would be done, like, they would have been fixed, like, it would be done by now. They had just listened to us, then so partly it's that they need to see other men behaving in certain ways or saying certain kinds of things in order to feel okay about doing it themselves. So that may also point to what part of the problem, but nonetheless, like, it's, you know, I see little signs of that kind of thing. Yeah.
I can also say that, for instance, in this process of participation to do projects and so on, men, of course, are participating as well. And I think this is a great way to exchange. And as I said, I think when we talk about space and services, it's such something, it's so concrete that then men understand, because they talk about something extremely practical, day-to-day life, and somehow this helped them also to understand what are the issues and the limits. Now in Italy, which is kind of very sexist country, many men refusing to speak in panels or events where there are no women. So we are talking about balance panel, just one woman, which is absurd, but it's something. So that also politicians are starting to give an example as well.
Okay, thank you. I think there's one more question here. Emily, it has actually been wonderful working from home and listening to my husband on phone calls. We've had a lot of conversations that I don't think would have happened with his female coworkers about speaking in a meeting and including women in the conversations. More like a comment, right? That's great. Yeah, more questions from the audience. Sandra, I have my phone here ringing.
Here, I'll just say mine. I was going to type it out, but I was going to ask about, how do you feel about not only the physical space and how it's designed, but also the internet and how it's designed? Because generally when you're like on an anonymous forum, you're thought of as being a white 20 to 30 something year old American man instead of like anything else. So I don't know, how do we change the design of the internet as well so that women are included in those narratives?
It's such an interesting question, because I think there's been a lot of examples of the ways in which just male tech designers sort of never think about certain kinds of things. So whether that's the ways in which, you know, digital tracking and location services can be dangerous for women to have on their phones, because they can be, you know, tracked, stalked, harassed, followed, you know, surveilled by their partners or whatever. And those questions like never occur to the male designers of those apps, it seems, or oh, someone was telling me recently, an example I heard the other day about mapping data and how there's like interactive things where people can like put in their like location data and use of space data and things like that, but it's primarily men apparently who do that. So the data, this big data that's being gathered is gender skewed based on who is participating in these data gathering projects. So yeah, a lot of it is very much like right from the kind of back end forward in terms of the design. So I don't know, I mean, partly the answer is again, this question of diversity in those industries and who is in the room. And we know from lots of like Me Too examples that those industries are full of harassment, very unfriendly to women in many cases. Their work-life balance is terrible. Like, you know, they want you to freeze your eggs so you can work for them for an extra, you know, 5 or 10 years before you have children, right? Like when you think about how ridiculous that is, so that has to be part of the process. And then, you know, kind of on the front end, the user experience, of course, like there's so much, to me, this also connects with questions of women in physical public space, is that once you're in public space, you're seen as like fair game for harassment, for comments, for sexualization. And it's the same on the internet. If you are in public on the internet, then you're expected to just take that harassment. It's seen as normal, natural, what do you expect? The exact same way it's seen as when you're walking down the street and someone catcalls you. If you complain about it, it's like, well, what do you expect? It's just how it's gonna be. So I think in both cases, we have to see like kind of a major cultural shift to make that kind of behavior completely socially unacceptable at a minimum.
Yeah, no, totally agree. We have one that's Catherine on the chat, Catherine Russo. So how are we helping build the capacity for women in leadership roles? This relates to Giulia's presentation.
Okay, I think it's a very important question. Just in this project that I'm doing in Tunisia, what we did is, first of all, to make an assessment of how the money of municipality were spent. So looking really at what kind of project, what kind of program, and if there was a kind of gender component on that, and then matching with the needs in terms of gender. So we did interviews and we assessed the needs at the municipality level of these communities. And we always had this open dialogue with women in the council or also in technical positions. So we did this kind of assessment with them, so to understand together with them what was the gender component within public affairs, for instance. And then we did also specific training for leadership. So in terms of decision making, public speaking, and also policy making. So how you define also a policy, how you define also a budget, municipal budget, for instance. So the big question of gender budgeting, for instance, I think is one of the really important tool that we can use much more at the national level, even at the EU level, so multilateral organization can use. So really to assess how we spend the money, because at the end it's about spending money. Where do we put the money? Where do we put the resources? And I think at the end we need to support through resources gender equality. So we need to prioritize projects that include women, that support women, empower women. I don't know if I replied to the question.
And I think to complement to that,
so the digital environment. So we have, as I said, local offices. So with colleagues that are from our local colleagues, so they continue to work more or less. And then, as I said, we are experimenting different type of engagement also online using, for example, WhatsApp, Facebook, that is quite used, for example, in Africa, much more than Twitter, and WhatsApp also to exchange idea or experience, like in groups. And then we have small small meetings with, I don't know, 10 people maximum in a room. We are also giving also internet connection and computer to people to be able to participate. So we did that, for instance, in Gambia. We provide some computers so people could interact and use and have internet, because the issue is also internet connection. That many people still now, so when we are talking about internet, many people don't even have access to internet. So this is complete in terms of access to information and empowerment is already an issue from the start.
Thanks, Giulia. How are we doing with time, Alejandra?
We're good.
We're good. I think it's such a great conversation. We just can't keep going, right? But I also want to be conscious about the time of our speakers. How? Any other questions or comments?
I wanted to share, I've put it in the chat a couple of times because last night my husband and I were feeling very overwhelmed, and we were trying to find something funny to watch before going to bed. And we discovered a sketch comedy of 4 women. I don't know if you've ever seen this, Baroness Van Sketch. And the first piece was that I put in the chat is what happens if women run the world. So it's 1 minute and 32 seconds if you want to watch it, and that will be like a really good resource for us to be able to sleep at night.
That's a Canadian show, so good choice there. Yeah, definitely a fan of that one.
Well, I think this whole conversation had been great. I think I want to open for Giulia and Les if you have any closing remarks from any other comments that you want to make, or any thoughts that you want to add here. So Giulia and Leslie, do you have any closing remarks?
I don't have any last profound remarks, but I just, I've learned a lot listening to Giulia's experience, and it's really helpful for me, as I say, because I'm not so much in the practitioner space. So to see some of those examples of the way that you are trying to fill some of those gender data gaps to try to encourage participation, and just seeing those little, again, they seem like micro examples from different cities around the world, because often a question that I get asked a lot in various webinars or events that I'm doing is, well, what city is the most feminist, or where, you know, what is the best city for women? And I kind of can't answer that question, but I like to be able to say, well, in this city, they've done this thing, and it might seem like this one small thing, that the mobile health creche, it might be the safety pin app, it might be, you know, improving public bathrooms, but like that to me is, you know, those bits and pieces that build the feminist city. So I can't really look around and say this city is or isn't feminist, but those examples that Giulia provided are really, they're great for me to hear about, so that I can keep answering that question with real world pieces. So, and thank you all for contributing to the conversation with your great questions as well.
Yes, I think this ranking also of cities, I don't believe in that, no? So I think it's more important to identify in each city what is working, what is not working, what are the policy that we can really use to leverage, that are doing well, and then we can leverage the experience, and then addressing the issues and connecting the good experience and people that are doing the right things, the right stuff. So I think it's important to point out to experience rather than model, because the model, I think they don't maybe exist. So also for me it was a very nice conversation, and I think it's such an important topic. We should continue to stay connected and to share what we are doing, and maybe have another conversation maybe in 1 year and see what happened in the meantime. So thank you also, Luciana, for this invitation. And it was a pleasure also, Leslie, to meet you again, and to everyone else as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much again, Giulia and Leslie and AWA+Z for the opportunity, and for everybody who woke up today or joining us today on this Saturday morning. And I think this is a great conversation. We definitely want to keep engaged and keep this conversation going. Thank you so much again, and I hope to see everybody soon. Stay safe, and we will talk soon. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. So nice to see you and meet you.